Welcome, everyone. On behalf of my fellow co-directors, Dr. Catherine Michael and Dr. Heather McCarty of the Lytton Center for History and the Public Good, I'm excited to welcome you to our first talk of the spring semester. My name is Dr. Kyle Livy. I'm a professor of history and co-director of the Lytton Center for History and the Public Good here at Ohlone College. We're really excited to have you join us today. Before I hand things over to Dr. Michael to introduce our first speaker of the semester, I want to go over some housekeeping and tell you a little bit more about the Lytton Center. The Lytton Center considers ways that the study of the past can help shape the present and the future. Our mission is to inspire the Ohlone community to work for the public good through programming focused on access, equity, inclusion, justice, and service. The Lytton Center explores challenges facing our community and the world, past, present, and future, and fosters big ideas that will inspire and transform Ohlone and the larger community for the better. Through training, programming, and capacity building, the Lytton Center empowers students to advocate for a just and equitable world. Today, we are really honored and pleased to welcome Dr. Chaya Crowder from Loyola Marymount University. And I'm going to have Dr. Michael give the introduction in just a moment and tell us a little bit about our speaker. While you're listening to this talk, which is going to be amazing, and I'm very excited, please do use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to share questions and go ahead and any ideas, thoughts that you want to share and have us discuss during our Q&A. You can also email questions to lyttoncenter@ohlone.edu. I'm going to pass things over now to introduce our speaker. Dr. Michael, are you there?
Kyle, it says the host has disabled my video. If you could please turn it on.
I absolutely will. I'm going to do that right now. I'm actually going to make you a co-host. Maybe do you have access to your video now? There we go.
Yes, hello everyone.
Fantastic. Okay, I had no idea I had that kind of power. Here we are. I'll pass it on. Go ahead, Dr. Michael, you're on.
Thank you, Kyle. I'm here to introduce our guest speaker today, and we're so happy to have her joining us. So Dr. Chaya Crowder is an assistant professor at Loyola Marymount University in the Department of Political Science and International Relations. She received her PhD from the Department of Politics at Princeton University, where she also received certificates in African American Studies and Gender and Sexuality Studies. Dr. Crowder's research and teaching interests include political behavior, race and ethnicity politics, social media and American politics, as well as gender and American politics. She uses an intersectional approach in her research to explore the ways that attention to race, gender, and sexuality have differential effects on political behavior. Dr. Crowder has appeared on CNBC. Her research has appeared in such journals as PS, Political Science and Politics, Perspectives on Politics, and the National Review of Black Politics. She has also written articles that have appeared in the Washington Post and the Griot. So Dr. Crowder, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Michael. I'm so happy to be here today virtually, and I'm excited to share this space with you all. I am going to share my screen and we will get started. Okay, great. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I am going to share some work with you from my sort of work in progress, my forthcoming book. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you. I look forward to your questions, your feedback, and just kind of having a sort of communal space here together. I would like to thank the Lytton Center for inviting me. And I'd also especially like to thank Dr. Catherine Michael for having me here today. With that, I'll go ahead and get started. So this project, it's motivated by an understanding that although we know that Black women have always played a central role in fights for racial justice as well as the women's rights movement, they have oftentimes been marginalized and given kind of limited attention when it comes to the primary issues that these movements have dealt with. Political scientists Claudine Gay and Catherine Tate note that historically civil rights organizations have had this sort of reductionist tendency that insists that racism alone accounts for all of the discrimination that Black people face. Similarly, in the women's rights movement, we've seen this tendency to only account for gender and to ignore these other parts of people's identities. And so when I started working on this project, I came across this clip on the TV show Blackish that sort of illustrated a lot of what I was grappling with at that time. And, you know, for centuries, Black women have voiced their concerns about the ways in which their perspectives and at times their existence has been ignored by these sort of broader, singularly marginalized groups, you know, thinking about, you know, women's organizations or racial justice organizations. In this Blackish episode, it kind of gave voice to the concerns that animate this project. So I'm going to play this clip for you.
They are right over there. Having Diane here is a good reminder of what we're all fighting for. Equality for all women. We know that we can create change, and we are not going to back down or give up. Not while we're all living through the worst thing to ever happen to women in this country. Okay. Whoa. I mean, these are really bad times for women, but it's not the worst thing to ever happen in our history. Slavery, because Black women were slaves. So this is your squad.
This clip, it always kind of cracks me up, but in a fun way, it depicts the ways that Black women have continued to feel marginalized in fights for equality. And even within this clip, it sort of illustrates the ways in which we can at times have our own sort of internalized blockages when it comes to thinking about who is marginalized at what axis of identity, right? Because, you know, in this clip, they don't mention the genocide faced by Indigenous women when considering the worst things that have happened to women in this country. So this clip, it kind of alludes to the 2016 Women's March, and it came out right after that, or the 2017 Women's March, excuse me. And when I began this project, like I said, it was around that time, right? So here on the left, we have a picture of me at the Women's March in New York. And on the right, there's a picture of activist Angela Peoples. This image kind of went viral surrounding the Women's March, and she has a sign that says, "Don't forget, white women voted for Trump." And, you know, it yet again speaks to the ways in which there has been this sort of racial and gender divide, and how the sort of intersectional concerns of Black women have at times been ignored. And so as a Black woman, I was particularly aware of the ways in which the concerns of Black women, and particularly the political issues that Black women face, were not a part of the conversation at this time. So while groups like white women and Black men have historically ignored the concerns of subgroups like Black women or LGBTQ people of color, there are some recent examples in which the opposite occurs. So I found these pictures of individuals with t-shirts that say "Stand with Black Women" by searching the hashtag Stand with Black Women on Instagram. These pictures include past Planned Parenthood president Cecile Richards and activist Sam White. And these shirts were made as a part of a campaign by Planned Parenthood to increase awareness surrounding some of the unique issues that Black women face. One such issue is the racial disparity in maternal health care. I'm going to talk more about that. And this is one of the issues that became particularly important to me as I was working on this project. Also the race gender pay gap. And so often, when you think about the issues that affect women or that affect people of color in political science discourse, they're kind of often focusing on these sort of broader issues like affirmative action or abortion rights, aid to Black, but rarely do folks examine the ways in which these issues disproportionately affect certain subgroups of the broader population. So while working on this project, I conducted interviews with Black women elected officials. And one of the interviews was with Congresswoman Karen Bass, who is now a Los Angeles mayoral candidate, and at the time was also the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. One of the questions that I asked her was, when it comes to political issues that affect Black women, do you think that anyone cares besides Black women? She responded by saying, I do. And I'll say that it's increased over the last couple of years. When it's all said and done about Trump, even though these last 4 years have been so painful, some good came out of it in the sense that he was so racist, so polarizing, so negative, that he really kind of pushed us together. A lot of us who wouldn't have interacted. So now we have this heightened awareness. So taken together, and considering, the current political moment at the time, and the marginalization that Black women continue to face, I asked this question: what are the conditions under which issues that are of concern to Black women matter to other people? Okay. So before moving forward, my research, it largely draws from scholarship in political psychology, and I'm also in conversation with Black feminist theory. And in particular, my work really builds on the theory of intersectionality. So I want to make sure that we have a clear definition of intersectionality as we move forward. So the term intersectionality, it's kind of become this buzzword, right? We hear it all the time. People throw it around. It's sort of become sort of shorthand almost for diversity. But we're going to kind of go back to its original intention and what it initially meant. And so, the theory, it has a complex history outside of the academy. And in many ways, this is why it sort of resists a concrete definition. But you can kind of generally think about it as the idea that axes of oppression, including race, gender, sexuality, and class, create interlocking forms of marginalization. So basically, people who experience marginalization at the axes of multiple identities, whether that's your race, your gender, your sexuality, your class, disability status, you experience unique discrimination that's different than other people because of these intersecting identities. And so often when we think about the term intersectionality, and particularly when it was developed by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, it was developed with Black women in mind. And so Black women are kind of this prototypical intersectional subject. The term was developed in legal scholarship as a way to kind of think about how Black women were not able to sue based on their race and their gender. You kind of had to decide, am I being discriminated against based on my race or my gender? But, the precedent didn't exist to say, what, both is happening here. And that's how the term intersectionality emerged. So I want you to keep the theory of intersectionality readily available in your mind. And now I'm going to turn to group consciousness. Group consciousness is a term in political science, particularly political psychology. And it basically means that what's good for the group is good for me individually. So what's good for the group that I see myself as a part of is good for me as an individual person too. it requires that you have some sort of in-group identification. So, I identify as a Black woman. And so group consciousness sort of asserts that, what's good for Black women broadly is good for me as a Black woman as well. And just kind of drawing this connection between your group identity and ways that you can collectively sort of advocate for the group that you see yourself as a part of. An example of group consciousness, particularly when it comes to Black consciousness, is called linked fate. Linked fate is a term that was developed by political scientist Michael Dawson, and it basically asserts that for Black Americans in the United States, because of this shared history and legacy of slavery, segregation, Jim Crow racism, that Black people, they view their life chances as connected to one another. So what does this mean? It means that for many Black Americans, they have a sort of shared political identity. We've seen time and time again, election after election, overwhelmingly 90% of Black Americans tend to support the Democratic Party. Is it because it's the best party in the world? No. But it's because there's this sort of general sense that what is good for the group is good for me individually. So regardless of your own personal socioeconomic status within the Black community, it's common to kind of share these sort of collective political beliefs because of this linked fate and this idea that you need to do what is best for the community broadly. But it's important in my research to also acknowledge that race alone doesn't account for all Black political identity. Gender, sexuality, class, immigration status, and other axes of identity matter as well. And so with that in mind, I developed my own theory that I call intersectional solidarity. So for my book, and in developing this theory, I build on the work of, the scholars that I discussed to develop my own theory. And so, as I've said, while some people, face marginalization on a single axis of their identity, maybe just their race, just their gender, just their sexuality, just their class, other people, and often, many people, are oppressed by a combination of their race, gender, class, sexuality, and disability. And so I argue that political consciousness extends beyond these singular identity-based groups. And so you can have something beyond just racial consciousness or gender consciousness, but instead you can have this kind of intersectional group consciousness where you are sort of simultaneously thinking about the ways in which oppression exists along these multiple axes of identity, and that having this awareness will in turn change the way that you think about politics and change the way that you think about what issues are important. So my sort of general definition of intersectional solidarity is that it's a set of beliefs that can be held by anyone, and is characterized by awareness and distress over the oppression of marginalized subgroups. So it just means that you're aware and you acknowledge that Black women, for example, experience sexism differently than other groups of women. Similarly, Black women experience racism differently than Black men. And so an important thing for me to note is that intersectional solidarity doesn't require in-group identification. So you don't have to be a Black woman to exhibit intersectional solidarity, because solidarity can be both in or out group. So you can exhibit solidarity with other groups that you're not necessarily a part of. And, kind of put simply, intersectional solidarity, it rejects this idea that racism alone accounts for all of the oppression that Black people face. Similarly, it rejects the idea that gender alone accounts for all of the oppression that women face. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about measurement and a survey that I conducted. And I wanted to sort of know, how could we use a survey to measure whether or not someone is thinking intersectionally, whether or not they have this intersectional group consciousness? And I'll kind of talk you through what I did to do that. So I fielded my own survey using an online survey research firm. I surveyed 2,445 people. I had an oversample of Black men, Black women, and lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. And so, you know, instead of having a sample that was completely representative of the United States population, I wanted to make sure that I had a large sample of particular groups. So that way I could look at differences between these groups. And so here's my sort of breakdown of the respondents that were included in my survey, sort of demographic breakdown. 51% of the people who took my survey identified as male, 49% identified as female, and that includes cisgender as well as transgender men and women. And 44% of my respondents identified as Democrats, 20% identified as Republican, 24% identified as independents, and the remainder identified as libertarians or Green Party members. Okay, so now I'm going to talk you through the sort of scale that I created. So to determine whether or not people think about issues intersectionally, I asked a number of statements, and I asked people to answer, do you agree or disagree with the following statements? And so my index included 8 different items, but here I'm sharing 4 statements. And these statements are intended to capture whether or not you have this sort of intersectional awareness and whether or not intersectionality is a part of your sort of consciousness. And so I asked, you know, for example, Black and white women experience sexism in different ways. Agree or disagree? If you agree with this statement that Black and white women do in fact experience sexism in different ways, then that would exhibit to me that you do have this sort of intersectional group consciousness. Another item is that in order to achieve the changes we seek, we must fight racism as well as sexism, homophobia, and transphobia. I'll leave these up for a second just so you can kind of get a sense for some of the questions that were included in the index. Okay. So you might be asking yourself, all right, so who has this thing? Who has this intersectional consciousness? What types of people have intersectional solidarity? And like I said, anyone can exhibit intersectional solidarity regardless of your race, gender, or sexuality. Based on my survey findings, I found that Black women had the highest sort of level of intersectional solidarity. And somewhat unsurprisingly, white men exhibited the lowest level of intersectional solidarity. But there is an important caveat. So like I said, I had large samples of LGBTQ plus individuals so that I could disaggregate that population. And I found that when I disaggregated white men based on their sexuality, I saw a huge difference. So white, gay, and bisexual men exhibited significantly higher intersectional solidarity than white straight men. Okay, so now that I've introduced my theory of intersectional solidarity as well as the way that I measured it, I want to turn to a discussion of how this matters for policy. So here on this slide, I have a Facebook post from Vice President Kamala Harris, where she states, The people of Georgia, especially Black women, turned out this week to help elect Reverend Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff. They deserve their moment of recognition and our thanks, but we must do more than thank them. Joe Biden and I are committed to addressing issues that disproportionately affect Black women, including pay disparity and maternal mortality. And so it's yet to be seen whether this is lip service or will actually happen, but these are the exact issues that I examine in my project. And her Facebook post, it also speaks to the importance of how understanding how we gain support for these issues have implications for the Democratic Party strategy, right? Black women are kind of seen as this hugely important part of the Democratic Party base. But when it comes to addressing issues that are of concern to Black women, oftentimes these issues are not given much attention and don't make it onto the political agenda. Okay, so here on this graph, in blue, you are seeing people who have high intersectional solidarity, so people in the 90th percentile. And in orange, you're seeing people with low intersectional solidarity. And I asked about whether or not people support addressing policies that would benefit Black LGBT youth with regard to LGBT youth homelessness. I asked about breast pumping in the workplace and providing a space for that. And I also asked about addressing the racial disparity in maternal health care, the pay gap, as well as policies that address domestic violence. So some of these issues are issues that have been explicitly racialized. Others people don't think of as racialized issues and maybe seem to be are in people's mind are more gender-based issues. And so based on that, we see these sort of large differences. So there's a particularly large difference when it comes to addressing support for addressing LGBT youth homelessness. So when people had high intersectional solidarity to people with low intersectional solidarity, we see a 53 percentage point decrease in support for addressing Black LGBT youth homelessness. Consistently across all of these issues, people with higher levels of intersectional solidarity, people who have this intersectional group consciousness, are more likely to support addressing issues that affect these marginalized groups. But when it comes to an issue like providing a space for breast pumping in the workplace, an issue that isn't necessarily explicitly racialized in people's minds, although it could be, we see a smaller difference. Nevertheless, consistently across these issues, when people have this sort of intersectional awareness, when they know that, Black women, for example, experience sexism differently than white women, they're more likely to view these issues as important and to support addressing these policy issues. Okay, so a quick summary of my results so far. In summary, I laid a foundation for a research agenda that focuses on moving beyond sort of studying group consciousness along these singular identities. I found that consciousness extends beyond just race, gender, class, and sexuality and can be intersectional in nature. I also found that intersectional solidarity is associated with support for policies that benefit intersectionally marginalized groups in particular. So now we're going to talk about some of the implications, and on my next slide, we'll begin a larger discussion of why all of this matters. So the Intersectional Solidarity Index, it allows us to better predict and understand the consequences of an increased attention to intersectionally marginalized groups and the issues that they face. I fielded this survey because I wanted to be able to demonstrate that when people think about race, gender, and sexuality differently, it has different policy consequences. People are then more likely to care about these issues that otherwise often don't make it onto the political agenda. I also, demonstrate that intersectional solidarity has implications for Democratic Party politics and also the way that the party thinks of its base. And I'll talk about that a bit more. So again, why does all of this matter? So after each recent Democratic electoral victory, it's become kind of commonplace for there to be a barrage of think pieces and tweets that follow, thanking Black women for being the backbone of the Democratic Party. Time and time again, Black women have been credited for the success of the Democratic Party in a number of consequential elections. We saw this in the 2017 Senate special election in Alabama, where they elected a Democrat to the Senate for the first time in a really long time. We, of course, saw this again in the 2020 presidential election, and then yet again in the 2021 Senate runoff in Georgia. And in each of these elections, an overwhelming number of Black women came out and supported the Democratic Party candidate. In the top left, I have a tweet from DNC President Tom Perez, and this was after the 2017 special election where Doug Jones defeated Roy Moore in Alabama and turned that historically Republican seat Democratic. And Tom Perez, he says here, Black women are the backbone of the Democratic Party, and we cannot take that group for granted. But there have been all these calls to thank Black women, but even still, we've yet to see a real sort of policy response. And Black women are tired, okay? And it's been said before, but it's worth saying again, that, Black women are not making attempts to save the Democratic Party, but instead we're making an effort to save ourselves. And we can kind of think back to linked fate, what's good for me individually is also what's good for the group is what's good for me individually. Okay, it's not about saving everyone else, but instead it's about saving ourselves. So at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that I conducted interviews with elected officials to better understand the relationship between Black women and the American political system. So in a conversation that I had with Congresswoman Barbara Lee, she stated, Black women have been totally loyal to the Democratic Party. They voted in numbers disproportionate to any other group in the Democratic Party, and they've always taken us for granted. And so in many ways, it's like, we need you, but we need you to a certain point when it comes to getting what we want. We don't want you with us to make these important decisions that we have to make. And, for me, this statement, it underscores the importance of understanding how we need to move beyond just getting folks to care about addressing political issues that affect Black women. But when it comes to the American political system, it's also important to give Black women a seat at the table. So I want to end on a somewhat optimistic note, hopefully optimistic note, right? And so with this in mind, a couple of weeks ago, President Biden issued this statement, and he said, I'm keeping the commitment I made during my campaign for president. I will nominate the first Black woman to the United States Supreme Court. So hopefully the Democratic Party establishment is going to do more than just thank Black women, and will actually put Black women in positions of power with decision-making roles. Thank you. Please ask questions, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crowder, for what a fantastic presentation. Everyone in the audience, please send us in your questions using Zoom's Q&A feature. I'm going to go ahead and ask one question that already came in there. So this comes from one of our guests who asked, are women of color Black women making any positive gains and advances in today's workplace, in addition to including pay and promotion disparities within today's workplace?
Okay, that's a great question. On social media, it kind of depends on like what sort of social media environment you're in, but on my timeline, I oftentimes see posts, about the ways in which Black women are becoming the most educated demographic in the United States. But we're still in this place where we're seeing a lot of first, right? We've yet to have a Black woman serve on the Supreme Court. And I feel like I'm continuously kind of surprised by, the number of times that I'm seeing a first or an only. I'm the only Black woman, I'm the only Black person in the Department of Political Science here at LMU. But that's changing and I'm excited. And so I think, progress has been incremental and slow. At the same time, if I like to kind of think of myself as a scholar activist. And if you think of yourself as an activist, you have to believe that change is possible all the time. And so I do believe that change is possible and that it's happening.
Am I next? Do I go? I'll go. Talk fantastic. And I have a lot of questions. I think one of the things I was thinking about is someone who teaches our queer studies course here at Ohlone and teaches it from an intersectional lens, is the notion that you've developed this theory of intersectional solidarity speaks to so many of the experiences that students learn about in that course, and really the students' experiences themselves that they're bringing into the classroom space when we talk. I also found this idea of linked fate really compelling. So my question is, what kinds of forces amplify or diminish that sense of linked fate? Because it's something I see resonating with other groups of people as well. And I think that's one of the driving forces behind this idea of intersectional solidarity is a commonality. And are forces like historical forces or contextual forces responsible for amplifying or diminishing that sense of linked fate?
I feel like as you were talking, there were like so many different things going on in
sorry.
my mind. No, for me, like I was like, oh, okay, am I gonna talk?
Me too. So it's like I was just like, oh, this is now part of this talk is now part of the course, by the way, just so you know. Like, get ready. I hope you're watching. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
So as it relates, as I was hearing about your course, the first thing I thought about is, the scholarly text that really inspired my work is largely Kathy Cohen's The Boundaries of Blackness. And so, in her work, she examines the ways in which issues that affect Black LGBTQ people, particularly the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 90s, how it's sort of been left off of the Black political agenda. And so I love that book. I love Kathy Cohen. I love her work. And in my work, I was like, okay, so we know about why groups have been excluded. And I want to try and, sort of have kind of flip that on its head and sort of, I'm trying to understand what are the circumstances in which people are included and when we come to kind of see these issues that marginalized groups, these marginalized subgroups face, when do we see them as important? You asked about the forces that kind of heighten or diminish linked fate, whether or not they're historical. When Michael Dawson wrote Behind the Mule, which is the book where he talks about this theory of linked fate, he was responding to William Julius Wilson's book, The Declining Significance of Race. And William Julius Wilson was basically making this argument that, okay, race, when it comes to Black people in America, that's not going to be what's important anymore. That's not what defines us. It's actually class. And class is this more important issue. And Michael Dawson was like, no, that's not it. Because regardless of income, regardless of class status, we still see Black people consistently supporting the same political issues, voting in the same way, because they have this linked fate, which comes from this sort of shared history. I'm doing another project right now that's really interesting and exciting. I love talking about it, so I'm going to mention it. And it's in Tulsa, Oklahoma, at this museum called Greenwood Rising. It's free, open, available to the public. They just opened a few months ago. And this museum was created in commemoration of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. And so in this museum, they kind of take you through these experiences where you really get to kind of put yourself in the shoes of the people who lived in Tulsa at that time. You can sit in a chair in a barbershop and you sort of have that experience. And we ask questions about racial consciousness. We ask questions about linked fate and see how kind of, having this sort of experience heightens linked fate among Black people who visit the museum. But we're also interested in how being exposed to these racial atrocities change and shape the way that white people think about what sort of policies they'll support, when it comes to reparations, when it comes to renamings of buildings, statues, etc. And so history definitely continues to play an important role when it comes to, group consciousness and linked fate, for sure.
Fantastic. Our new project sounds amazing. Okay, we'll talk later. I really want to hear more.
I mean, have me in your class or whatever. I'd love to come back and share more. I'm really excited about that project.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Oh yeah, we definitely need to have you back. I also want to hear more about that project. And it actually sort of segues a little bit into something that I was wondering when I was looking at your data that you're putting up that, very clearly shows that, the higher level of intersectional solidarity, the more likely you are to support policy issues, to support other marginalized groups. And so I was wondering, how do we shift that? How do we get more people to have that higher intersectional solidarity orientation? And so I'm so curious to see if exposure is one of those answers.
Absolutely. So yeah, you're right that there's a great sort of connection between this other project that I'm working on and thinking about how you sort of activate, group consciousness and what are the kind of educational interventions that make a difference. And I think that's right. It's education, it's exposure. And so in this other project that I'm working on, I'm kind of trying to sort of determine what sorts of educational interventions are most effective. Does it work to just read an article, or do you actually need to meet a person and have a sort of personal exchange? And then also, how durable and lasting are these effects? Do you just feel that difference like right after learning about it? Like, oh yeah, or 6 months later, does it kind of stick with you? And these are questions that I'm still grappling with now.
I am excited for you to find the answers because I would like those answers. And I think lots of other people would too. So I'm really excited about this project and your next project.
Thank you so much.
As am I, just to add on to the chorus of people saying we're absolutely going to have you back again. Of course.
It's funny how it's like you kind of like, it's like intersectional solidarity. I'm excited about it. I'm still deeply working with it. But then like when you're working on like this other new side thing too, it's like always kind of with you.
Of course. Well, our next question actually comes from a geography professor at Ohlone. And his question is, I appreciate the attention to big, important questions. You mentioned southern states like Georgia and Alabama a few times, and I'm curious if you noted any particular spatial or geographic patterns that jumped out in your survey from rural, urban to regional scales.
I think that's a really great question. I did not look at the way in which place sort of played out in this, but I'm supplementing my empirical sort of survey stuff with focus groups. And I think there would be a great place for me to kind of explore the ways that place kind of comes into this. And so, yeah, it's definitely something that I want to explore more and hope to kind of tease out as I do interviews and just kind of talk to people. There's a lot of things that the numbers can show, but I found oftentimes that, your research is always helped by just having conversations with folks. And I actually have some focus group data now from my interviews in Tulsa. And so, I could potentially bring some of that in as well, because the museum is attracting people from all over. And so there's a lot of folks who are coming locally, but I found that like 55% of the people who come to the museum are actually from out of state. So there's a lot of regional variation there. And so I might be able to use that to help kind of tease that out.
Great, thank you.
I think Heather has the next question.
I do. And this is a question from one of my gender and women's studies students, and it's a fantastic question. So I will share it with you. And it is, I have heard that white women are often seen as the face of the feminist movement. What can we do as other racial groups to share the spotlight and draw attention to more issues that affect Black women?
That's like such a great question. It's also such a big question. And so I'm thinking about how to kind of, sort of parse it out. So I have like all of my research broadly focuses on race and gender and is like intersectional in nature. But, from my bio, it was also noted that like I do a lot of stuff with social media in my research. I have an article that I published that explores the way in which exposure to different messages on Instagram shape how people think of certain issues as important as opposed to others. In one of my projects, I have these Instagram posts and they're representations of women at the Women's March. And so you can either see an Instagram post of a white woman holding a sign. And in this case, the signs say, "I hope I'll see all you nice white ladies at the next Black Lives Matter march." Or you can see a Black woman holding that same sign. And I wanted to examine whether or not the race of the person you see holding the sign matters for if you're able to sort of really take in that message and if it shapes the ways that you view issues as important and also the kind of emotional responses that it sort of brings up. And, I found that people do respond differently based on the race of the messenger. When people saw a Black messenger, particularly white people who had higher levels of racial resentment, they might view that woman as like, they kind of viewed the Black messenger as a complainer, and I'm tired of seeing all these signs, this, that, and the third. Whereas when white people were exposed to the white woman holding the same sign, it sort of elicited more white guilt. And in this case, guilt, which is a sort of negative emotion, had positive implications for whether or not people viewed race as an important issue. And so one thing that became really clear to me through that project is that saying things, posting things, sharing things with your own network actually matters. When people hear things, from someone who they can identify with, it might hit differently than when they hear it from someone who they think, oh, she's just got an agenda, there were all these different, I had an open-ended response and people could tell me how they felt after seeing it. And they're like, oh, that's just a social justice race warrior, things like that. As opposed to when they see someone who they kind of identified with racially, they sometimes were more open to hearing those messages. And so I think I take all of this to say, use your network and you can sort of amplify these voices just within your community, post on your own social media and, kind of continue to give voice to these issues.
Great, thank you. Super interesting research as well.
Heather,
The article is in a journal called Politics, Groups, and Identities. It's a great journal. I strongly recommend it. And it was called When Black Lives Matter at the Women's March, if you want to sort of check it out.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Heather, there's a follow-up question from the same, so if you scroll down.
Oh, yes, there is. There is a follow-up question. Thanks you, Dr. Libby.
That is actually two questions, by the way. So two parts in one, which I'm always
It's also we're discussing about the concept of androcentrism in my women and gender studies class with Dr. McCarty. Do you think androcentrism has influenced party agendas or political issues, or is it informed primarily by what is quote unquote popular with the public?
So I'm going to need a definition of androcentrism.
Just male at the center, male-centeredness.
Okay, male-centeredness. Do I think, what's the question again? Do I think that androcentrism
has influenced party agendas or political issues, or is it informed primarily by what is like popular with the public? So I think that
absolutely, totally. I mean, yeah, it's like, where do we even begin there? Like, okay, where do we begin there? So I mentioned Kathy Cohen's work before, and my dissertation advisor was Kathy advised her, and she does this book on what she calls affirmative advocacy, Dara Strolovich, and she basically finds that, you know, when it comes to the political agenda, people are much more willing to support issues that they view as consensus issues that affect the whole group, or issues that people perceive as affecting the whole group. But more often than not, consensus issues tend to be issues that affect men, you know, and then cross-cutting issues are these issues that affect marginalized subgroups. And so I think that that's something that, you know, in my own work, I want to challenge, you know, the idea that these consensus issues are in fact the issues. But that's kind of what we see time and time again. I mean, even when you think about, you know, the civil rights movement or the Black political agenda, you know, oftentimes we're looking at issues that disproportionately affect the sort of most privileged groups within these marginalized groups. So, you know, thinking about affirmative action, you know, which is an important issue, but is an issue that affects, you know, oftentimes more privileged people within this sort of broader group. You know, when it comes to thinking about, you know, policing, when it comes to thinking about the movement for Black lives, oftentimes the names of Black men who have been, you know, victims of police violence and have been murdered are more readily available than Black women, Black cisgender women, or Black trans women who are disproportionately exposed to violence and harm. And so I think that we kind of see this sort of continue to replicate itself in a number of different ways, for sure.
Great, thank you. That's a fantastic answer. And the say her name, hashtag say her name movement, it's fantastic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Kind of a question that sort of picks up on that because it's connection to social media, something I am admittedly terrible at. More later. Do you think that social media, especially with the younger generation, has helped somewhat increase the exposure to intersectional viewpoints? This is a question from one of our audience members.
Absolutely. I mean, I think in many ways, although inequalities exist and continue to sort of replicate themselves online, social media has made access to some information, you know, a lot easier for people. I was just on a call yesterday with my son's daycare about mommy and me groups. I've never done a mommy and me group. And I was asked, why haven't you done a mommy and me group? And one of the reasons was that, you know, I feel like I found kind of community online, you know, I've been able to sort of read a lot myself. And so although we're in a formalized setting here, you know, and most people probably in this room and this virtual space are now receiving access to formalized education, there's so much that you can learn online. And so I think that social media, that's true there as well.
I think that's really insightful. I feel like I've told this to folks when a lot of students come in when they're really kind of figuring themselves out at Ohlone. They're trying to figure out and understand their identities and really complicated ways, and they're learning about themselves from other people online, even in something as simple as TikTok, right? They're connecting with people over large distances. I tell folks all the time that I learned about what it meant to be queer from AOL. You know,
not AOL.
I know I look timeless, but let me tell you, but it's true, because honestly, had I not had that resource, there would have just been this darkness and this space there, right, where I wouldn't have been able to see. And so it's a much broader and more diverse landscape. And I think we tend to focus on the siloing within social media, but there's actually this other side to it. I think that's really insightful. Catherine, I think you're next.
I am, and this question actually goes in a different direction. So the question is, within higher education, do you think equity or equitable are overused terms?
That's a great question too. I've sort of been grappling with this in some work that I'm doing right now with the university in terms of their sort of goals to sort of develop equity in STEM. And as a professor, sometimes I do feel like, the administration has grown so large within institutions, and we develop these different task forces, and oftentimes, in doing that, things become sort of so big, and you're not in conversation with the people who are being affected by these issues. I think prioritizing, what students want, first, and then, what faculty's needs are after that. And so do I think equity and equitable are used too often? I don't know if I could say that, but maybe these terms are used too broadly. And so I think we can kind of connect this back to the talk in thinking about intersectionality and how some terms, and I think equity would be included in this, they become these sort of buzzwords and it becomes shorthand. And when that happens, we no longer have a clear understanding of what we're talking about. And it's something where you're like, oh, maybe, like pornography, it when you see it. But I think that it's really important to be really clear with regard to what you mean and what your goals are, and what equity means for you and for the space that you're operating in. And I think through having kind of a clear understanding and a really concrete and actionable understanding of what equity means, it can become more meaningful.
Thank you.
Great. I have the next question, and this question is for all of our budding political science students out there. And this is sort of a process question, really, and it's focused on if you could share with sort of what are the biggest challenges that you faced in conducting your own research, sort of some of the pitfalls, and then maybe also sort of, the highlight of your research as well.
I love this question. In part because the course that I'm teaching right now, I'm teaching a course on research design. And so perfect.
Lining it right up for you.
Yeah, it lines up perfectly. I literally just finished teaching that before I came here. So I'm also advising a couple of students on their honors theses right now. And so I'm kind of seeing a lot of this play out in real time. We oftentimes go into a project with like these lofty goals in terms of, maybe the number of people you're going to survey, the number of people you're going to interview. And then things happen, especially now, in 2022, going into the third year of the pandemic. You can have the best of intentions and then COVID, and it can affect your research in unexpected ways. I think oftentimes when you're setting out to do your first project, your second project, your third project, a lesson that you're always kind of learning in research and research design and research execution is kind of how to deal with disappointment. Things don't oftentimes play out as you expect them to. It's good to have a plan and good to have a design, but it's also important to kind of be flexible. Like I said, I'm doing this survey right now at the Greenwood Rising Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. COVID has affected, protocol at the museum. We went in the field at one time, like we started doing the survey, a couple of months ago. We thought we would be done by now, but now we're pushing it out even longer. And so sometimes you're going to have to adjust your timeline. You may say, hey, I want to conduct, interviews with 40 activists, but you might only be able to get, 20. And that's still great and meaningful. You don't need to have these big numbers, in order to say something meaningful with your research. I presented data today where I had, 2,445 survey responses. That's great. But sometimes you can learn just as much from having, 20 conversations with real people and hearing about the ways in which they their everyday conversations about politics.
That's great perspective. I love it. And flexibility, right? It's like everybody's new term we need to embrace in so many places, not just in the world of research.
Totally.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I kind of want to piggyback on this a little bit. So I'm an Ohlone student. I show up to this talk. I am blown away, which is going to describe everyone who's been at this talk. And I'm like, this is what I want to do. I want to study race, gender, and politics.
Yeah.
What is your, first off, what is your advice about where to go next? And then I think our students would love to hear more about your story of how you discovered your path.
I also love that question. These are all wonderful questions. So in terms of me, like becoming a researcher and becoming a professor, this was nothing that I had any exposure to. I don't know that there are a lot of people who are like, when they're little, when I grow up, I want to be a professor or do research, no, like I thought I was going to be a lawyer. I was like, I need to make money. Okay. And so when I started school, when I started college, that was my plan. I was going to be a lawyer. And I kind of had that in the back of my mind for a couple of years. And then I had my first Black professor, I think my junior year in college. So my third year in college, I had my first Black professor. And his name was Dorian Warren. Dr. Dorian Warren's awesome. And it was weird because all those years I had teachers, I had professors before, but seeing someone who looked like me doing it changed my conception of what it was. And all of a sudden I was like, I want to do what Dorian does. Like, I want to do that. And so I went up to him and I said, will you mentor me? And he was like, yeah, sure. And honestly, I'm like, he's single-handedly so responsible for so much of my trajectory and my path, because I didn't know anything about research. I didn't know anything about what it took to be a professor. And even when I started grad school, so much of it was just constantly being demystified for me because I didn't know anything about any of this. All I knew was that, I thought what he was doing seemed really cool and that I wanted to do it too. And so if this is something that you're encountering for the first time or is a thought that's just crossing your mind, I would say, to kind of go after it. You don't have to know what you're doing. There are people who will be there to help you along the way. And I'll make an even bigger gesture just because I know that, there are only a few people in the room who will actually take me up on it. I will personally, I would love to talk to you. If you can email me, I'm a real person. And so my email is just my first last name at lmu.edu. So shaya.crowder@lmu.edu. And sometimes that's it. You just need one person who can kind of give you a roadmap and say, all right, these are the next steps. And so you don't need to plan out the next 5 years, but as long as you know just what you need to do next to get there, you can start kind of taking those steps. So whether it's, reading your personal statement, if you're applying to transfer, or reading your statements for grad school, whatever, maybe you don't want to talk to me right now, but, my email is in the chat. And so you can take it down now and just save it. And, when you're ready, please feel free to just reach out to me directly. And I would love to help you with next steps.
For the record, my heart is melting.
But the thing is that I can make that gesture because maybe one or two people will take me up on it. And if it's you, then great. I'm so glad that you happen to be here today on this call and that we've connected because someone did it for me. Right. And so I'm so excited by the idea of being able to do it for someone else.
And I think that's the thing in talking to our students it's that relational piece and connecting with someone and reaching out that can
Yeah.
be so scary, but practice with someone you feel, one of a faculty member, a
Yeah.
staff member you feel comfortable with, and start to build some of those relationships. And they will help you to build up that confidence.
100%. I felt crazy when I walked up and was like, will you be my mentor? But
Yeah.
like it turned into a career. So it worked out.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think like, I feel like that it can be a really terrifying thing, because you
Yeah.
see, I think for a lot of folks, especially first gen students who are seeing their professors, it can feel like there's this barrier. And
Yeah, I mean, it's always crazy to me that like this idea just never crossed my mind until I had like
Yeah.
this one particular professor who kind of like none of the other, it never dawned on
it's
me.
important that we see ourselves in the folks that are mentoring and teaching us.
Yeah,
That's
totally.
a really key. So, okay, people, I hope you wrote that down. Yes. Okay.
So much great advice. Thank you so much for the offer, Chaya. As I was thinking about what you were saying, I was thinking back to my own experience as an undergrad, and I really wanted to do research for this professor, and I was so nervous. And I actually was talking to my mom on the phone, and my mom was like, "What's the worst thing he can do? Say no." And so I went in there.
Who told me too. Like my mom was like, ask him to be your mentor. And I was like, are you crazy?
Yeah, exactly the same. And I went in there and he said yes. And then like my whole trajectory changed. So
Yeah.
just to back up exactly what you were saying. So I actually have several of my own questions. So I'll leave it up to you, Chaya. I have a methods question, or I have more of a current events question. Which would you prefer?
I'm down for either, but let's go with the methods one first.
Okay, so the methods one is about the index you talked about. So I talk a little bit about methods in my political science classes, and we talk about indices. And this concept, right, of intersectional solidarity is just inherently difficult to measure. Yeah. And so I was just curious if maybe you could kind of talk us through your process and maybe the most difficult part or the critiques you get most often and your response to those.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. I'm worried about answering it just because I feel like in this talk, like one of the things that was most exciting and challenging for me is that I had to try and speak to a really broad audience in a way that when you're doing academic talks, you're not always used to. It just becomes so jargony. And then you step back and you're like, what am I even saying? Like, what do these words mean? I've just gotten so used to saying these words. I don't know what I'm talking about anymore. But this was great for me because as I work on my book, it's important to kind of just have more sort of regular talk like you're talking to real people. And so now that I'm going back into like my methods bag, I'm like, oh no, am I going to fall back into jargon? But making an index, making a scale is hard. And so I think the first thing that I would say is that like I entered this with like a lot of like, intellectual humility. I'm like, this is not going to be the best scale of all time, but this is a place to start. And so I showed you all on the slides 4 of the questions that I asked to kind of get at whether or not people have this intersectional consciousness. I asked 8 questions total. And so I had 4 questions where like, for example, like Black and white women experience sexism differently. That's something where if you agree with it, you're exhibiting intersectional solidarity. But I also had questions where the reverse was true, where I wanted to see people disagree with questions to show that they had intersectional solidarity. Because when people are answering surveys, they kind of just have an inclination to agree. And so I wanted to make sure that I wasn't getting too many sort of like false positives. In terms of pushback and questions that I get, I've gotten a lot of questions about, this is kind of a methodsy thing, but like how well the items sort of scale together. Do these items belong in the same index? And so there's different numbers like that you can calculate to determine whether or not they work well together. And so that's something where I've had to kind of be really specific in explaining why these items do work together. But yeah, so I mean, if these items are something that are interesting to you, what I will say is there's this survey, and it's called the CMPS, the Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Survey. It's like a co-op. It's a survey that's a co-op, and like different professors can buy into it, and you can buy questions. So that way you get to have questions that are asked on this big national survey. And so I included 4 of these items on the 2020 CMPS. And so in 2023, we're now in 2022, so that's only next year. This is all going to be made publicly available. So anyone who's interested in looking at these survey questions can have access to them and can look at, okay, how does answering these questions affect the way you feel about the Black Lives Matter movement, or affect the way you feel about whether or not you are a person who is likely to, go to a protest, or whether or not you're a person who supports the environment. Who knows? Any sort of like there's so many questions on this survey. I included these items in it, and so you can kind of just play around with it and see, if it connects to any of the research that you might be doing on your own when this is made available to the public in 1 year.
Great, thanks so much.
Do you want to do the current events one now?
Yeah, you should do it, Catherine. I want to hear what it is.
Oh geez. Sorry, I have to pull my questions back up.
No pressure.
I have 2 actually. So let me start with one. So I was actually curious about the news that we've all been hearing for quite some time now about attempts to ban critical race theory. And I was curious how that has impacted your research and in your interviews, if this has come up and in what ways.
Mm-hmm. So things have just kind of fallen together in Tulsa. And at one point I reached out to a faculty person who I know at like the University of Oklahoma, and they happened to know someone who was doing research with the Tulsa public school system. And so they connected me with people there. And then they were like, oh, wow, you guys are doing all this research at the museum to explore how going to the museum shapes the way you think about, politics, policies. Well, starting in 2021, we're requiring that the Tulsa Race Massacre and what happened is taught in schools. From 3rd grade to 12th grade, every, student in Tulsa will have this curriculum, on the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so they invited us to survey their students. And so we are working on that now, but in terms of pushback, in order to survey, children, people under the age of 18, we have to get consent from their parents. And, in a place like Tulsa, everyone's not excited about this even being taught in classes. And so that is a barrier that we've kind of come up against in terms of kind of figuring out how are we going to survey children when it requires parental consent, when, this sort of discourse around banning critical race theory, this isn't what this is, in schools is, making some parents, less than excited about having their kids as a part of like any of this. And so, we're still trying to kind of figure that out. Like, and we're not trying to trick anyone, but like we've thought of things like you might have a flyer that you take home where unless you bring it back signed, you do take the survey. And we all remember those in school. And so, yeah, it has affected some of our work so far.
Thanks so much for that. I was assuming that it would have in some ways.
Yeah, when I had to think about it, and I was like, oh yeah, the Tulsa parents who don't want us to survey their kids.
You should do the other one too. Now I'm really curious what the other current events question is.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So this one is, I guess this is probably just your opinion in this case, but you were talking about, you gave a quotation, I think that was that Black women have been loyal to the Democratic Party. And so my question was actually going to be, do you see any evidence or do you have any idea of what would actually make Black women stop being loyal to the Democratic Party when the alternative is perhaps worse?
So in short, I would say probably nothing, right? And that's really unfortunate. Paul Freimer has this book called Uneasy Alliances, and I love it. I feel like such a nerd. I am such a nerd, whatever. And in the book, he develops this theory of electoral capture. And he basically just says Black people have essentially been captured by the Democratic Party because they know that the alternative is so much worse for Black people that they have nowhere to go. And so the Democratic Party no longer needs to do anything to appeal to Black people because short of abstaining or not voting, they don't really have a real viable alternative. Eddie Glaude, who's a professor of religion, he wrote a book called Democracy in Black. And this book came out like right before the 2016 presidential election. And he argued that Black people who are not in swing states, so, if you're in California or New York, or somewhere that like that, who you vote for president isn't going to affect the outcome, then you should abstain and just vote down ballot. So only vote for local people and don't vote for the presidential election, because then they would know that, hey, we're paying attention and you can't take us for granted. He got a lot of, pushback, hate mail, death threats, all sorts of things for even suggesting that. And so, it's really difficult, right? Because on the one hand, in my work, I'm trying to sort of understand, how do you get people to care? How do we get policymakers to care? How do we get the mass public to care? But on the other hand, time and time again, we're kind of shown that like, well, the Democratic Party doesn't really have to care, because, the vote is sort of guaranteed anyway.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. I wasn't aware of that book. Actually, I'll have to check it out, thinking about the strategic voting. Yeah, that's very interesting. It is interesting though, to think about now President Biden's promise about the Supreme Court justice, taking into account that, well, in reality, in the sad reality, he probably wouldn't have to do this, which is interesting. Are there either Heather or Kyle? I've just been taking over here.
No, this has been great. I love this. This is the best part of my day. I love it.
Thank you. This has been wonderful for me too. I'm so glad that this worked out. It's been a crazy couple of weeks, but this is kind of a really sort of wonderful way to kind of bring everything together for me in this time. And so I really appreciate this space. It's been wonderful.
I think one thing I keep thinking about this is that we're so lucky to have you and your expertise to share with our students and with our community. I've been thinking about this a lot, how important it is that I think the idea of expertise is under attack. It's like, I can do my own research online and develop my own theory. Right. I won't go there. Right. We don't need to go there. But this idea is actually a central part to growing and being able to develop and create our own knowledge, right? As students, as we work through higher ed, ideally, right? And that to open doors to folks to be able to do that requires us to start to see incredible people who have this incredible expertise and are creating knowledge as you are, to show different paths and different ways to do that, and really exciting, really path-breaking research. So just appreciate you so much.
Thank you.
I'll just piggyback on Kyle and add one more thing that I think is especially fantastic about having you today. I very much enjoyed your talk. I think it's great for our students to see a model of what an activist academic looks like, and to understand how academic research actually has real world applications.
And I will say that's like what I loved about Dorian. He was working, doing a lot of labor union stuff at the time, the professor that kind of motivated me to do this. And you don't have to, maybe you're not going to do it now. Like, I didn't go straight to grad school, after finishing. He actually got me a job working with a labor union and also doing research with a sort of social justice organization, the Center for Popular Democracy. And I love doing social justice research. You don't have to be an academic to do research. And so I think that's important to note as well. And so, I'm really glad that you kind of brought that up. And I think that's super important.
Catherine, do you want to?
So I think with that, we're probably going to start wrapping up. I want to, of course, again, thank Dr. Chaya Crowder for being here with us and giving a fantastic presentation and also just really great answers to all of our questions. And for everyone in the audience, I want to just share quickly a flyer for our next our next panel, which is actually a long ways away. It's in April 21st, but it's going to be on contemporary Asian American activism, building movements for liberation, and we'll have a panel featuring 4 different panelists. And so we hope you all will be able to join us then. We will be sending out reminders as we get closer to that time. And so again, just on behalf of myself and Dr. Chaya Livy and Dr. Heather McCarty, thank you so much, Chaya, for being here with us today.
This was awesome. Thank you all.